There are games that feel like they were always meant to exist, as though they arrived fully formed from some quiet corner of imagination, carrying the weight of worlds that feel inevitable and real. Pokemon is one of those games, and yet behind every route, every town, every carefully named creature, there lies a long and winding development history that most players have never fully traced. The regions we explore today, from the gentle hills of Kanto to the sun-drenched plains of Paldea, each passed through years of iteration, revision, and quiet creative courage before they became the places we know. And before you drift off, consider subscribing for more calming journeys like this, and thank you for helping us gently approach 2,000 subscribers tonight. The story of how each region came to exist is also the story of how a small Japanese company named Game Freak slowly transformed a personal creative vision into one of the most enduring entertainment franchises the world has ever known. Each new region required not just new Pokemon and new towns, but entirely new philosophies about what a Pokemon game could be and what it was allowed to feel like. The development of each region carries echoes of the people who made it, the constraints they worked under, and the quiet decisions that sent the series in one direction rather than another. What follows is a long and unhurried journey through that history. It is the kind of narration best experienced slowly, in the dark, with no particular urgency. Each region will be given the space it deserves, from its earliest conceptual origins to the decisions that shaped its final form, and somewhere in that telling, a picture will emerge of how one of the great creative legacies of modern culture was built, one careful choice at a time. The development of Kanto began not with a map or a roster of creatures, but with a feeling. Satoshi Tajiri, the creator of Pokémon, grew up in Machida, a suburb of Tokyo, during a period when the area still contained open fields, streams, and wild places where a curious child could spend an afternoon collecting insects and watching frogs. That childhood experience of exploring small ecosystems, of the particular satisfaction of discovering something living in a place you had not looked before, became the emotional seed from which the entire Pokemon concept would eventually grow. By the time Tajiri was a young adult, Machida had been absorbed further into the expanding urban sprawl of Greater Tokyo. The fields he remembered were gone, replaced by roads and buildings, and the creatures that had once made those fields feel alive were gone with them. There is a melancholy in that shift that Tajiri has spoken about in interviews, a sense that something genuinely valuable had been lost as Japan modernized, and that children growing up in those newer, cleaner, more paved environments would never have access to the particular kind of wonder that comes from finding a beetle under a stone or watching a tadpole grow legs in a jar on a sunny windowsill. Pokemon began, in Tajiri's earliest conception, as an attempt to give that experience back. Not the literal experience of catching insects, though that metaphor would prove enormously durable, but the emotional experience of discovery, of the feeling that the world contains more than it first appears, and that patient exploration will always be rewarded. This foundational feeling shaped Kanto's development in ways that are still visible in the finished game. The tall grass hides creatures. The caves are dark and require specific tools to navigate. The world resists easy completion and rewards those who return to earlier areas with new abilities and new knowledge. Tajiri founded Game Freak in 1989 as a game development company, having previously run it as a fanzine covering the early Japanese arcade scene. He spent years pitching the Pokemon concept to Nintendo before the company agreed to support the project, and even then, the development stretched across 6 long years, from 1990 to 1996, a period during which Game Freak came perilously close to running out of funding on multiple occasions. The team was small, at times numbering fewer than 10 people, and the ambition of what they were attempting to create frequently exceeded the resources available to them. The region that would become Kanto took shape during those difficult years as a kind of map of possibility. The 8 gyms were arranged to guide the player through a journey that had a beginning, a middle, and an end, but the world between those gyms was designed to feel open, to suggest that the boundaries of the game extended further than any single playthrough could fully reveal. The location of Pokémon in the tall grass and in the caves was carefully considered, creating a sense that the world was a habitat rather than a stage set, that creatures had been placed where they were for reasons connected to the ecosystem rather than simply to serve the player's convenience. Kanto's geography drew loosely from the real Kanto region of Japan, the area surrounding Tokyo, though the translation was impressionistic rather than literal. The coastal cities reflected Japan's relationship with the sea. The mountain areas in the north and west suggested the mountain ranges that frame the real Kanto plain. The train that connects Saffron City to Goldenrod City in Johto, added later, extended that geographical metaphor in a direction that made intuitive sense to anyone familiar with Japan's rail infrastructure. None of this was meant to be a lesson in Japanese geography, but the underlying logic of the real landscape gave the game world a coherence that players could feel even if they could not articulate its source. The original 151 Pokémon were designed over those 6 years through a process that Ken Sugimori, the lead artist, has described as iterative and sometimes chaotic. Early designs were rougher and stranger than what appeared in the finished game. Some creatures were cut because they were too complex to render on the original Game Boy hardware. Others were revised because they felt too menacing or too abstract for the tone the team was trying to establish. The process of choosing which 151 Pokémon would appear in the final game involved constant revision and negotiation, with some designs surviving almost unchanged from their earliest sketches and others transforming dramatically through the development process. The original Game Boy hardware imposed strict constraints on what the game could do and how it could look. Every Pokémon sprite had to be legible at a small size on a screen with minimal resolution. Every route had to be navigable within the memory limits of the cartridge. The music, composed by Junichi Masuda, had to create emotional atmosphere using only a few audio channels. These constraints shaped Kanto's aesthetic in ways that proved unexpectedly durable. The simplicity that was forced on the developers by their hardware became, in retrospect, a defining quality of the game's visual and sonic language. Kanto looks and sounds the way it does not entirely by choice, but the result is a coherence of aesthetic that later, technically richer games have sometimes struggled to match. The decision to release the game in 2 versions, red and blue, was one of the most consequential in the history of the franchise. The idea was Tajiri's, inspired by a game mechanic he wanted to create that would give players a reason to seek out other players. If some Pokémon appeared only in red and others only in blue, then completing the Pokédex would require trading, and trading would require social contact, and social contact was precisely the kind of experience Tajiri wanted the game to foster. The link cable, which allowed 2 Game Boys to exchange Pokémon and battle each other, was the technological foundation for a social experience that would prove enormously popular, especially among the elementary school children who became the game's primary audience. Pokémon Red and Blue launched in Japan in February 1996 to a reception that was initially modest. The game received positive reviews, but not the immediate explosion of popularity that would eventually come. It was through word of mouth and through the particular enthusiasm of children who had found something genuinely new in the game's premise that the audience grew. By the time Pokémon Green, the 3rd version released only in Japan, appeared, and certainly by the time the franchise crossed to North America and Europe in 1998 and 1999, the cultural phenomenon was already well established. Kanto was not just a game region by then, It was a world. The development of Johto began almost immediately after the success of Kanto became apparent, but the team faced a challenge that no one had entirely anticipated. Making a sequel to a game that had succeeded so thoroughly on the strength of its novelty required finding a way to be both familiar and new, to give players the feeling of returning home while simultaneously opening doors onto something they had not seen before. The creative team at Game Freak approached this challenge through a decision that proved both elegant and technically demanding. Johto would exist alongside Kanto, connected to it geographically, so that completing Johto's story would allow players to travel back into the world of the first game. This decision shaped Johto's development in profound ways. Because Kanto had to be reproduced in the new game, the development team was working with twice the geographical scope of the original, and they had to ensure that both regions felt fully realized rather than one feeling like a diminished echo of the other. Johto was deliberately designed to contrast with Kanto's feeling. Where Kanto had a brisk, modern energy, Johto would feel older, more contemplative, more rooted in tradition, and in the slower rhythms of a world that had not yet been entirely remade by modernity. The aesthetic inspiration for Johto drew from the Kansai region of Japan, the area around Kyoto and Osaka, which carries a very different cultural atmosphere from the Tokyo-centered Kanto region. Kansai is associated with temples, with traditional arts, with a certain pride in historical continuity that contrasts with Tokyo's restless appetite for the new. Ekritake City, with its tin tower and burned tower, became the heart of Johto's emotional and thematic identity, a place where the presence of the legendary Pokémon Ho-Oh and Lugia was felt most keenly, and where the game's mythological dimension was most clearly expressed. The legendary beasts, Raikou and Entei and Suicune, whose existence was tied to the burning of the Brass Tower generations before the game's events, were among the most narratively complex Pokémon that Game Freak had yet created. Their backstory required the game to gesture toward a history that predated the player's arrival, a world that had existed and suffered and changed before any of the events the player could witness. This sense of historical depth, of a world with a past that the player could only partially access, became one of Johto's defining qualities, and one of the things that has given it such lasting affection among players who encountered it during its original release. The development of Pokémon Gold and Silver also saw significant technological advances over the original Game Boy games. The move to the Game Boy Color allowed for a richer visual palette, and the team used color to differentiate between the many different environments that the expanded game world contained. The day and night cycle, one of Johto's most celebrated innovations, required the game to track real-world time using an internal clock, a technical achievement that created an experience of the game world as genuinely inhabited, changing in rhythm with the player's own daily life. Pokémon breeding, another of Johto's major contributions to the series' mechanical vocabulary, was developed partly as a way to give players more control over the Pokémon they raised, and partly as a way to deepen the sense that Pokémon were living creatures with biological relationships to one another rather than simply collectible objects. The discovery that many Pokémon could produce eggs at the daycare center, and that those eggs would hatch into baby versions of Pokémon that had previously only been available in their evolved forms, created a new dimension of engagement with the game's systems that players found deeply satisfying. The friendship mechanic, which tracked how much a particular Pokémon liked its trainer and affected certain in-game outcomes, was another Johto innovation that reinforced the game's emotional emphasis on the relationship between trainers and their Pokémon. Certain evolutions required high friendship, not just particular items or trade conditions, and the sense that a Pokémon could feel something toward its trainer, could be neglected or cared for in ways that shaped its development, gave the game's emotional architecture a depth that surprised many players who had come expecting simply a richer version of the original. The design of Johto's Pokemon roster presented particular challenges because many of the most memorable design spaces had already been claimed by Kanto's original 151. The team responded to this challenge in several ways. First, they introduced cross generational evolutions, new final or intermediate forms for Pokemon whose original evolutionary lines had ended, giving players who remembered creatures like Scyther and Onyx and Eevee new reasons to seek them out. Second, they created baby Pokemon, pre evolutionary forms that could only be obtained through breeding, which gave familiar Pokemon a new dimension of biological completeness. Third, they created the Unknown, the alphabetical Pokemon discovered in the ruins of Alph, whose strange design and enigmatic presence suggested connections to a deeper layer of the game's mythology. The connection to Kanto, when finally revealed after the completion of Johto's main storyline, became one of the most celebrated moments in the franchise's history. The ability to board the ferry to Vermilion City and find Kanto waiting, somewhat reduced in scope but unmistakably present, created a feeling that few games had previously achieved. The journey culminated in the ascent of Mount Silver, where the player encountered Red, the protagonist of the first game, waiting in silence at the mountain's peak, surrounded by his team. That encounter, wordless and resonant, has remained one of the franchise's most emotionally powerful moments. The development of Hoenn began in a period of genuine uncertainty for the Pokémon franchise. The games were being ported to the Game Boy Advance, a new piece of hardware with significantly greater capabilities than the Game Boy Color, and the creative team had to decide how to use those capabilities. More importantly, they had to decide what kind of experience they wanted Hoenn to provide. The decision they made was to move away from the continuity with Kanto and Johto that had defined the first two generations, and instead create something that felt genuinely fresh, a new region with a new identity that did not depend on familiarity with what had come before. Hoenn was designed around water. The decision to make the region predominantly coastal and aquatic was both a creative choice and a practical one. The Game Boy Advance's hardware could render water effects in ways the earlier Game Boys could not, and the team wanted to showcase that capability. But the emphasis on water also reflected a thematic decision. Hoenn would be a region defined by the tension between nature and civilization, and water, as the element most clearly associated with the natural world's capacity to overwhelm human constructions, would be the appropriate environment for exploring that tension. The real-world inspiration for Hoenn was the Kyushu region of Japan, the southernmost of Japan's main islands, known for its warm climate, volcanic activity, and coastal scenery. The volcanic landscape appears in Hoenn through Mount Chimney and the surrounding areas, while the coastal character is expressed through the many water routes that cover the eastern and southern portions of the map. The game's designers took the Kyushu inspiration as a loose framework rather than a strict template, using it to establish the region's general character while filling in the details according to the needs of the game. The legendary Pokémon of Hoenn, Groudon, and Kyogre were among the most conceptually ambitious the series had yet attempted. Where earlier legendaries had been powerful and rare creatures that existed within the game's world, Groudon and Kyogre were forces of geology and meteorology, entities so vast in their power and influence that the game had to handle them as something approaching natural disasters rather than simply very strong Pokémon. Their conflict, the awakening of Groudon to expand the landmass, and the awakening of Kyogre to drown the world in water, gave the game's storyline a scale that had not previously been attempted. Rayquaza, the dragon of the sky that existed in equilibrium with Groudon and Kyogre, completed the elemental triumvirate and introduced the idea that the game's most powerful legendary might not be the one that drove the main conflict, but rather the one that resolved it. This structural choice, the hidden superior force that emerges to restore balance when lesser powers have pushed the world to the edge of destruction, became a recurring template in subsequent generations and remains one of Hoenn's most influential narrative contributions to the franchise. The villainous teams of Hoenn, Teams Magma and Aqua, were deliberately designed as mirror images of each other, two organizations with opposed but internally coherent ideologies, each convinced that their vision of the natural world's ideal state was correct. Team Magma wanted to expand the landmass, believing that more land would benefit both humans and Pokemon. Team Aqua wanted to expand the ocean, believing that a world closer to its primordial water-covered state would be more hospitable to wild Pokemon. Neither team was straightforwardly evil in the way Team Rocket had been. Both were committed to a vision they genuinely believed in, and the tragedy of their conflict was that both visions, pursued to their logical extremes, would destroy the world they were trying to improve. Pokemon contests, one of Hoenn's most distinctive additions to the series' mechanics, were developed as a way to give players an alternative to battle-focused progression. The contest system allowed Pokemon to be evaluated on 5 qualities: cool, beautiful, cute, clever, and tough, and required players to select moves not for their battle efficacy, but for their appeal in a particular category. This system recognized that the players who had grown up with Pokemon included many who found the competitive battle system less appealing than the collecting and nurturing aspects of the game, and it created a parallel progression path that those players could engage with more fully. Secret bases, another of Hoenn's signature features, gave players the ability to claim a hidden location in the game's world and customize it with furniture and decorations. The system was powered by the Game Boy Advance's wireless adapter, which allowed players who encountered each other physically to visit each other's bases and even battle the recorded teams of the base's owner. This feature embodied one of the franchise's persistent themes: the game is better when it creates connections between players in the physical world, and the joy of sharing your personal space with a friend is a genuinely different kind of pleasure from the satisfaction of winning a battle or completing a collection. The development of Hoenn also marked the introduction of Pokemon abilities, passive qualities that gave each Pokemon a characteristic behavior independent of its moves and stats. The ability system transformed the strategic depth of competitive battling, creating interactions between abilities, moves, items, and typings that significantly expanded the range of viable strategies. Some abilities, like Intimidate, which lowered the opponent's attack upon entering battle, had immediate and obvious effects. Others, like Hustle, which increased attack at the cost of accuracy, created trade-offs that required more thoughtful engagement with the game's mechanics. The Pokeblocks system, which allowed players to create stat-boosting treats for their Pokemon using berries blended in a berry blender device, added another layer of engagement with the game's systems and reinforced the sense that preparing a Pokemon for competition, whether in contests or in battle, was a process of cultivation rather than simply the accumulation of experience points. The depth of these systems meant that dedicated players could spend hundreds of hours with Hoenn's content without exhausting its possibilities, a quality that has contributed to the region's enduring popularity. The development of Sinnoh represented Game Freak's most ambitious attempt yet to give a Pokemon region a fully realized mythological foundation, where previous regions had contained legendary Pokemon that were powerful and significant. Sinnoh's legendaries were not merely powerful creatures that happened to live in the region. They were the forces that had created the universe itself. Arceus, the normal-type Pokemon introduced in the game's lore as the being that shaped existence from nothing, gave Sinnoh a cosmological weight that no previous region had carried. The decision to ground Sinnoh in mythology of such fundamental scope required corresponding depth in the region's geography and narrative. Mount Coronet, the massive mountain range that divided the region, was conceived from the beginning as a sacred place, the literal center of the game's world, the location where Arceus was said to have first touched the material universe. Every element of Sinnoh's geography was designed in relation to Mount Coronet, with the lakes housing the Lake Trio, Uxie, and Mesprit and Azelf, serving as the emotional counterpoints to the mountain's cosmological weight. The inspiration for Sinnoh drew from the Hokkaido region of Japan, the northernmost of the main islands, known for its cold winters, dramatic mountain landscapes, and the indigenous Ainu culture, which has a spiritual tradition centered on the natural world and its invisible forces. The presence of these cultural influences gave Sinnoh's atmosphere its particular quality of ancient mystery, the sense that the land itself contains knowledge and significance that predates human habitation and will persist long after human concerns have faded. Team Galactic, Sinnoh's villainous organization, was led by Cyrus, one of the most philosophically coherent antagonists in the series' history. Cyrus was not motivated by greed or a desire for power in the conventional sense. He was motivated by a profound dissatisfaction with the nature of existence itself, by the conviction that the world of matter and emotion was fundamentally flawed, and that the only solution was to unmake it and create something better in its place. This nihilistic philosophy gave Sinnoh's narrative a depth that had not previously appeared in the franchise, raising questions about meaning and existence that were genuinely adult, even as they were presented within the framework of a children's game. The physical special split, introduced in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, was one of the most significant mechanical changes in the series' history. Before this change, whether a move was classified as physical or special was determined by its type: fire, water, electric, grass, ice, psychic, dark, and dragon moves were always special, while normal, fighting, poison, ground, rock, ghost, bug, flying, and steel moves were always physical. This meant that many Pokemon's intended design niches were not supported by the mechanics. A large, physically powerful fire type like Arcanine would use its attack stat to throw physical punches, but its special attack stat for Flamethrower, creating a disconnect between the creature's design and its optimal mechanical usage. The new system, which classified each individual move as physical or special based on its nature rather than its type, resolved these inconsistencies and opened up enormous new possibilities for competitive play. Pokémon that had previously been considered weak found new viability when their signature moves were reclassified to take advantage of their strongest stats. The change required significant revision of how players thought about their teams and their strategies, and it permanently transformed the landscape of competitive Pokémon in ways that are still felt in the present day. Sinnoh also introduced the Underground, a subterranean multiplayer space beneath the region's surface that players could access using the Nintendo DS's wireless communication features. The Underground allowed players to dig for fossils and rare items, to create and share their own secret bases, and to participate in Capture the Flag-style minigames. This feature extended the social dimension of the Pokémon experience in new directions and reinforced the DS era's emphasis on local wireless play as a primary means of player connection. The Poke Radar, a tool that allowed players to locate and chain encounters with specific Pokémon, was another Sinnoh innovation that deepened the game's engagement possibilities. Chaining encounters with the same Pokémon species, maintaining a sequence of encounters without encountering a different species or breaking the chain, increased the probability of finding a shiny version of that Pokémon with rare alternate coloring. This mechanic created a type of gameplay that was simultaneously relaxing and suspenseful, requiring patience and attention while delivering the kind of gradual reward escalation that many players found deeply satisfying. The mythology of Sinnoh extended beyond the main legendary trio to include the creation mythologies recorded in tablets found throughout the region. The Sinnoh texts described a moment before the universe existed and a being that existed within that nothingness, moving through an expanse of complete emptiness before creating the first egg from which the world and all of its fundamental forces hatched. These narratives gave the Pokemon universe a cosmological history more detailed than anything that had previously existed in the series, and established Sinnoh as the mythological center of the game world in a way that still resonates in later games' lore. The development of Unova represented a deliberate and in some ways radical departure from everything that had preceded it. Game Freak made the decision, which was controversial among some segments of the established fan base, that Pokemon Black and White would be presented with a Pokemon roster containing only creatures new to that generation. Players would not encounter familiar faces from previous games while progressing through Unova's storyline. The original Pokemon, Pikachu and Geodude and all the rest, would be unavailable until after the main game's credits rolled. This decision was motivated by a desire to recreate the feeling of the original games, the sense of encountering a world full of creatures that were entirely new, whose behaviors and evolutions and types were not yet known. The team recognized that a significant portion of their audience, by the time of Black and White's development, had grown up with Pokemon, had played multiple generations of games, and approached new releases with the encyclopedic familiarity that comes from years of engagement. These players could no longer experience the genuine novelty of not knowing what a Pokemon would evolve into or what type it would turn out to be. The real-world inspiration for Unova drew from New York City and the broader northeastern United States, a choice that marked the first time a Pokemon region had been modeled primarily on a location outside of Japan. This decision reflected the franchise's global reach by the time of Black and White's development, and represented an acknowledgement that the game's audience was international in a meaningful way, not simply as an export market, but as a community with its own relationship to the franchise's identity. The narrative of Black and White was more ambiguous and more philosophically engaged than any previous Pokemon game had attempted. N, the game's primary antagonist, and simultaneously one of its most sympathetic figures, was a young man who had been raised exclusively among Pokemon and had developed as a result the ability to understand their speech. His conclusion from this ability was that Pokemon were fundamentally unhappy in their relationships with human trainers, that the practice of capturing and training Pokemon was a form of exploitation that neither Pokemon nor the humans who truly loved them should want to continue. This argument, which N presented with genuine conviction, and which the game did not entirely dismiss, gave Black and White a moral complexity that the franchise had not previously explored so directly. The relationship between humans and Pokemon had always been presented as mutually beneficial, but N's challenge forced the player to confront the possibility that this presentation was itself a kind of comfortable fiction, that the game's central mechanic of capturing and training wild creatures might look different from the creature's perspective than it did from the trainer's. The game ultimately reaffirmed the value of the human-Pokemon bond, but it did so having genuinely engaged with the counterargument rather than simply ignoring it. The development of Unova also coincided with significant advances in the Nintendo DS's hardware's capabilities, which the team used to create a game world with more visual dynamism than any previous entry. Bridges moved. Seasons changed the appearance of the landscape over real-world months. The camera pulled back in certain areas to reveal the game world from new perspectives. These technical achievements served the narrative purpose of making Unova feel like a place with genuine physical presence, a world that existed beyond the edges of the screen. Pokémon Black and White 2, released 2 years after the original games, took the unusual step of being sequels set in the same region rather than third versions with enhanced content. The decision to create true sequels with a new protagonist and a story set 2 years after the events of the first games allowed the development team to show Unova in a changed state, with new areas unlocked and old ones altered by the passage of time and the events of the previous game's narrative. This approach was unprecedented in the franchise's history and demonstrated a commitment to Unova's storyline as something with genuine narrative weight that deserved to be followed through rather than simply retold. The season system, one of Unova's most distinctive features, changed the appearance of the game world every real-world month, cycling through spring, summer, autumn, and winter in a pattern that required players to wait or advance their DS's clock to access certain seasonal content. Certain Pokémon appeared only during specific seasons. Certain areas were accessible only when a specific season's conditions were met. This mechanic reinforced the sense that Unova was a living environment that existed in time, subject to natural rhythms that operated independently of the player's schedule. The development of Kalos began during a period of significant transition for the franchise. The move from the Nintendo DS to the Nintendo 3DS brought with it the ability to render the game world in 3 dimensions rather than in the top-down perspective that had defined the series since its beginning. This was not merely a technical shift, but a profound aesthetic question. What should Pokémon look like when the creatures could be presented with genuine depth and form? The answer, for Kalos, involved a design sensibility that leaned toward elegance and grace, qualities that reflected the region's real-world inspiration. The inspiration for Kalos drew heavily from France, particularly from the cultural imagery of Paris and the French countryside, with its café culture and grand architecture and particular relationship to art and beauty as central human values. This choice gave Kalos a distinctive atmosphere compared to all previous regions, one in which aesthetic pleasure was explicitly valued alongside the more familiar themes of adventure and competition. Lumiose City, the game's central hub, was designed as a grand urban environment that evoked Paris through its architecture and layout without being a literal reproduction of it. Mega Evolution, Kalos's defining mechanical innovation, introduced the idea of temporary transformation during battle, a process through which certain Pokémon could achieve a more powerful form for the duration of a single fight. The system required both the presence of a Mega Stone, specific to each Pokémon capable of Mega Evolution, and a Keystone held by the trainer, and the bond between trainer and Pokémon was explicitly invoked as the mechanism that made transformation possible. This framing reinforced one of the franchise's persistent emotional themes, that the relationship between a trainer and their Pokémon is itself a source of power, that caring and being cared for can change what is possible. The Fairy type, introduced in Kalos as the first entirely new type since the franchise's second generation, required significant revision of the type chart to accommodate it. Fairy-type Pokémon were strong against Dragon-type moves and immune to Dragon-type attacks, addressing what many competitive players had identified as an imbalance in the type chart's structure. The introduction of a new type, after so many years without one, was a significant creative and mechanical decision, requiring not only the creation of new Pokémon and the reclassification of existing ones, but also a careful consideration of how the new type's interactions would affect the existing competitive ecosystem. The history of Kalos, revealed gradually through in-game texts and encounters with NPCs who held pieces of the region's past, centered on a devastating war fought 3,000 years before the game's events. The war, in which countless Pokémon died fighting alongside their human partners, led one king to create the ultimate weapon, a device powered by the life force of Pokémon that could end all conflict by ending everything. The emotional resonance of this history gave Kalos a kind of melancholy depth that complemented its surface beauty, a sense that the elegance of the present was built on the sorrow of the past. The X and Y legendary Pokémon, Xerneas and Yveltal, embodied this duality directly. Xerneas was associated with life, capable of granting eternal life to those it chose to share it with. Yveltal was associated with destruction, capable of absorbing the life energy of all living things around it before entering a millennial sleep. These two forces were in balance in the game's mythology, but the history of the ultimate weapon had disrupted that balance, and the events of the game were shaped by the consequences of that ancient disruption. Player customization, introduced in Kalos, allowed players to change their character's appearance through clothing and hairstyles, creating a personal visual identity within the game world. This feature, which seems modest in retrospect, represented a significant philosophical shift in how the games conceived of the player's relationship to their protagonist. Previous protagonists had been defined, silent figures through whom the player experienced the game world. The ability to customize your character's appearance created a more explicit identification between player and protagonist, making the journey through Kalos feel more personally inhabited. The development of Alola required the development team to answer a question that had not previously been central to any Pokemon region's design. What does it mean to create a region with a specific living cultural tradition at its heart? All previous regions had drawn on real-world inspirations, but those inspirations had generally been filtered through a lens that emphasized geography and aesthetics while maintaining a certain cultural distance. Alola's Hawaiian inspiration was more direct, engaging with the spiritual practices, community structures, and ecological relationships that characterize indigenous Hawaiian culture in ways that required more careful and respectful consideration. The island challenge that replaced Alola's gym system was the most direct expression of this cultural engagement. Rather than collecting badges from gym leaders in established buildings, players in Alola completed trials on each of the region's 4 islands, facing challenges set by the island's kahuna and confronting totem Pokemon, unusually powerful versions of species that called for help from allies mid-battle. The structure of these trials reflected indigenous Hawaiian practices around coming of age and community belonging in ways that were clearly intentional and gave Alola's progression system a distinct emotional character compared to the gym badge formula. Regional variants looks at one of Alola's most celebrated contributions to the franchise's design vocabulary, express the idea that Pokemon evolve to suit their environments in ways that produce genuine morphological diversity. Alolan Raichu had developed a psychic typing and the ability to surf on its own tail, adapted to the relaxed coastal lifestyle of the islands. Alolan Marowak had become a fire and ghost type, its bone transformed into a flaming weapon by ancient spiritual practice. Alolan Exeggutor had grown dramatically taller, taking full advantage of the tropical sunlight to develop into a dragon-type creature, quite different from the one familiar to players of earlier generations. The regional variant concept resonated so strongly with players and proved so creatively generative that it has been expanded in every subsequent generation, becoming one of the franchise's primary tools for revisiting older Pokemon with fresh designs and new mechanical possibilities. The success of this concept was not entirely predictable at the time of Alola's development. There was genuine uncertainty about whether players would embrace dramatically altered versions of beloved creatures, or whether the changes would feel like violations of established identities. The Ultra Beasts, extra-dimensional entities that appeared in Alola through dimensional rifts, called Ultra Wormholes, introduced a genuinely alien element into the Pokemon universe. These creatures were classified as Ultra Beasts rather than Pokemon, a distinction that the game's in-game organization, the Ether Foundation, maintained with some insistence, though players could catch them and train them as they would any other Pokemon. The Ultra Beasts' designs were deliberately strange, in some cases verging on the genuinely unsettling, with body plans and color schemes that did not follow the conventions of ordinary Pokemon design. Necrozma, introduced in the later Sun and Moon games and expanded significantly in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, became the lore central figure of the Alola game's mythological dimension. The light that Ultra Megalopolis was built to capture, and the light that Solgaleo and Lunala channeled through their cosmic powers, were all connected to Necrozma, a being that had once been a source of light itself before being shattered in an ancient conflict. The restoration of that light, and of Necrozma's original state, became the emotional heart of the Ultra Games narrative, and gave the Alola games a mythological arc comparable in scope to Sinnoh's creation mythology. The Festival Plaza, the multiplayer hub introduced in Sun and Moon, replaced the Pokémon Center wireless features of previous games with a more elaborate social space where players could participate in events, exchange festival coins, and interact with visitors from other players' games. The Palago system, which allowed Pokemon stored in the PC box to explore islands and gather items while the player was not actively engaging with them, created a sense of the game's Pokemon population as genuinely present and active, even when the player's attention was elsewhere. The development of Galar was shaped by two intersecting creative ambitions. The first was the desire to take the Pokemon franchise onto home console hardware for the first time, creating a game that could be played on a television screen and would take advantage of the Nintendo Switch's larger display and greater processing power. The second was the desire to create a region that felt genuinely British, capturing something of the atmosphere and cultural character of the United Kingdom in a way that would be recognizable to players familiar with that country while remaining accessible to the global audience. The development of the wild area, the open world section of Galar that players could explore freely in real-time 3D, represented the most significant departure from the traditional Pokemon game structure since the series began. Rather than navigating through a series of routes and towns connected in a mostly linear path, players in the wild area could move through a landscape that responded to real-time weather conditions, encountering Pokemon that varied depending on both their location within the area and the current weather. This created a sense of the wild area as a genuinely dynamic environment rather than a static backdrop. Dynamaxing and Gigantamaxing, Galar's battle mechanics, expressed the region's cultural obsession with spectacle and scale through a system that temporarily enlarged Pokemon to enormous sizes, giving them access to powerful max moves that changed the battlefield for several turns. The visual presentation of Dynamaxed Pokemon was designed to feel genuinely impressive, communicating the idea that Galar's unique energy, the wishing stars, and watt-powered phenomena associated with the region's geological history could transform ordinary battles into events of mythological significance. Max Raid battles, which allowed up to 4 players to cooperate in challenging a Dynamaxed wild Pokemon in a den, extended the social dimension of the Pokemon experience in a new direction. Rather than competing against each other, players in Max Raids had to cooperate, coordinating their attacks and using their respective Pokemon's abilities to chip away at a shared challenge. This cooperative structure was new to the mainline games, though it drew on dynamics familiar from the spin-off Pokemon games and from broader trends in multiplayer game design. The Galar region's relationship with its legendaries, Zacian and Zamazenta, was expressed through the mythology of the ancient Darkest Day, a past catastrophe in which Eternatus, a Pokemon of extraterrestrial origin, had released vast amounts of the Galar particles that power Dynamaxing, threatening to destroy the region. 2 hero Pokemon, Zacian and Zamazenta, had worked together with human companions to defeat Eternatus and seal the threat. The return of the Darkest Day in the game's present storyline and the rediscovery of Zacian and Zamazenta created a narrative that tied the region's competitive sporting culture to a much deeper tradition of human Pokemon cooperation in the face of catastrophe. The Crown Tundra expansion to Galar, released as downloadable content after the main game, introduced an ice and snow environment in the region's north that had not been accessible in the base game. This area allowed the return of legendary Pokemon from previous generations through the Dynamax Adventures system, in which players could cooperate in a series of max raid battles leading to an encounter with a powerful legendary. The Dynamax Adventures format created a new kind of structured cooperative challenge that rewarded coordination and preparation while remaining accessible to players who approached it casually. The development of Paldea began with a question that had been implicit in Pokemon game design for years and had been approached incrementally through features like Unova's moving bridges, Kalos's more dynamic camera, and Galar's wild area. What would a fully open-world Pokemon game feel like? The answer required not just technical solutions, but a fundamental rethinking of how the game's progression would work, how the player's sense of freedom would be structured so that it felt genuine rather than illusory. The inspiration for Paldea drew from the Iberian Peninsula, primarily Spain and Portugal, with their combination of historical architecture, varied landscapes ranging from Mediterranean coast to high desert plateau, and cultural traditions that include both intense local pride and a long history of global contact. The game's academy setting, around which much of the narrative was organized, evoked the Spanish educational tradition of the great university city, a place where young people gathered from across a wide area to learn and to form the relationships that would define their adult lives. The three parallel narratives of Paldea, the Victory Road Gym Challenge, the Path of Legends Titan Hunt, and the Starfall Street confrontation with Team Star, gave players genuine choice about which story to pursue at any given time, which gym leader to challenge, which Titan to face, which Team Star base to storm. The progression of all three narratives led toward Area Zero, the great crater at the center of the Paldea map, where the game's deepest mysteries were located and where the narrative's most significant revelations occurred. The Terrastall phenomenon, Paldea's battle mechanic, allowed Pokemon to change their type completely during battle, covering themselves in crystalline structures that refracted light in the colors of whatever type they had terrastallized into. This system created layers of strategic complexity in competitive play, as a Pokemon's Terra type might be kept secret until the moment of transformation, creating opportunities for surprising type advantages and disadvantages that neither player could entirely anticipate. The Terra Raid battle system, which organized cooperative challenges around powerful terrastallized Pokemon in crystals found throughout the open world, extended the cooperative dimension first explored in Galar's Max raids. The Paradox Pokemon of Paldea, ancient and future forms of existing species that appeared in Area Zero, represented one of the most conceptually unusual contributions to the franchise's design vocabulary. Ancient Paradox Pokemon appeared to be prehistoric ancestors of recognizable modern species, large and physically imposing, where their descendants were smaller and more adapted to coexistence with humans. Future Paradox Pokemon appeared to be mechanical or biotechnical descendants of those same species, their organic forms partially replaced by technological components. The implication that Pokemon species could be observed across vast stretches of time through the dimensional phenomena of Area Zero gave Paldea a temporal depth that extended beyond even Sinnoh's cosmological mythology. The rideable legendaries, Koraidon and Miraidon, serving as the player's primary means of traversing Paldea's open world, created an unusually intimate relationship between the player and the game's most powerful Pokemon. Rather than simply catching and training these legendaries, the player spent the entire game in partnership with them, relying on their abilities to run, swim, climb, and glide. The gradual restoration of Koraidon or Miraidon's full abilities over the course of the game, as new traversal skills were unlocked created a sense of the legendary as a companion whose growth was intertwined with the player's own progress through the region. The development history of Pokemon regions is also the development history of a creative team growing more confident, more ambitious, and more willing to challenge its own conventions. Game Freak in 1996 was a small studio creating a game that its own publisher was uncertain about. Game Freak, in the decades that followed, became a studio capable of creating one of the world's best selling game franchises, and the pressures and possibilities that come with that scale of success shaped the development of every subsequent region in ways both visible and subtle. The question of what stays the same across all regions, the 8 gym leaders, and the Elite Four and the champion, the rival and the professor, and the starting town with its small complement of buildings, is as interesting as the question of what changes. The core structure of the Pokemon journey, which has remained remarkably consistent across 9 generations and more than 25 years, creates a framework that players carry with them from game to game. The moment you step out of the starting town and see the first patch of tall grass, there is a feeling of recognition that no amount of regional novelty can entirely displace. That recognition is not merely nostalgia, though nostalgia is part of it. It is the feeling of a structure that has been refined through iteration until it fits as naturally as an old piece of furniture in a familiar room. The Gym Challenge works because it provides a sequence of achievable goals with sufficient difficulty to feel genuinely challenging while remaining broadly accessible. The Elite Four works because it provides a gauntlet of difficulty that rewards the training and preparation invested throughout the game. The Champion works because the final battle is emotionally weighted by everything that preceded it. The development teams across all generations have worked within this structure while finding new ways to inflect it to give it local meaning. In Kanto, the structure was the thing itself, the foundation upon which everything else was built. In Johto, the structure was enriched by its connection to Kanto and by the depth of the mythology surrounding the legendary beasts and Ho-Oh and Lugia. In Hoenn, the structure was placed in tension with the elemental conflict between Groudon and Kyogre, so that the Gym Challenge felt like it was occurring against a backdrop of genuine world historical stakes. In Sinnoh, the structure was embedded in a cosmological mythology of such fundamental scope that completing the Gym Challenge felt like one small part of a much larger story about the nature of existence. The evolution of the rival character across Pokemon generations reflects a broader shift in how the games conceptualize the player's relationship to the game world's other inhabitants. The original rival, Blue in Kanto, was openly contemptuous and explicitly competitive, driven by a desire to defeat the player that made him something approaching an antagonist. As the series progressed, rivals became more nuanced, more complex in their motivations, sometimes more friendly, sometimes more melancholy, sometimes struggling with personal difficulties that the player could observe without fully being able to address. The shift from the Kanto rival to the rivals of later generations represents a shift in the game's emotional sophistication, a recognition that the game world contains people with interior lives that deserve consideration. The professor figure, present in every main series game, has similarly evolved while maintaining its essential function. The professor provides the starter Pokémon, explains the basic premise of the game's world, and establishes the initial quest of understanding the Pokémon around you. But the personality and narrative role of each professor varies considerably across generations. Some professors are absent or peripheral after the opening sequence. Others remain present throughout the game's narrative, pursuing their own research threads that intersect with the player's journey in meaningful ways. The professors of recent generations have been given more detailed backstories and more significant narrative functions, reflecting the game's increasing narrative ambition. The design of starter Pokémon, the choice of 3 species representing fire, water, and grass types with which the player begins each new game, has been one of the franchise's most reliable exercises in character creation. Each trio of starters must feel distinct and appealing, must offer players with different temperaments a Pokemon they can identify with, and must have evolutionary paths that feel satisfying and meaningful. The design of the starters' final evolutions, in particular, has become a subject of intense community interest and discussion before each new game's release, as players speculate about what their initial companion will eventually become. The development of starter designs across generations shows a shift toward more elaborate and thematically rich evolutionary paths. The original Kanto starters evolved in straightforward directions. Bulbasaur became more plant like, Charmander became a more imposing fire dragon, Squirtle became a more heavily armored water turtle. Later generations introduced evolutionary paths with more complex thematic content. Incineroar, the final evolution of Alola's Firestarter Litten, became a professional wrestler-inspired Pokémon, incorporating human cultural forms into what had begun as a simple kitten design. Cinderace, the final evolution of Galar's Firestarter Scorbunny, became a soccer player, directly referencing Galar's sports-obsessed culture. The gym system's development across generations shows consistent creativity in finding new ways to make the fundamental formula of defeating a type specialist trainer feel fresh. Early gyms were often straightforward. The leader used a particular type. You assembled a team capable of countering that type, and you fought. Later gyms introduced environmental puzzles, rotating floors, and invisible walls and icy surfaces that had to be navigated before reaching the leader. More recent games have created more elaborate pre-leader challenges that integrate thematically with the leader's personality and the surrounding town's character, making each gym feel less like a standardized test and more like an encounter with a specific person in a specific place. The Elite Four structure has been a more conservative element of the franchise's design, maintained across generations with fewer significant variations than the gym system. The choice to present the Elite Four as a sequence of increasingly difficult battles, culminating in the champion, creates a specific kind of pressure that many players find genuinely exciting, particularly on first playthroughs before the team composition of each trainer is known. The champion battle has been the site of some of the franchise's most memorable narrative moments. Lance and Johto, Steven and Hoenn, Cynthia and Sinnoh, each serving as the apex of the region's challenge, while also representing something of the region's character. Cynthia, in particular, has achieved an unusual status in Pokémon mythology. She remains many players' favorite champion, a figure of elegant authority whose team composition and battle music create a genuinely challenging encounter that the community has discussed, strategized around, and returned to repeatedly across the many years since Diamond and Pearl's original release. The cultural persistence of Cynthia as a figure of respect and mild intimidation says something interesting about what players value in a champion encounter. Not simply difficulty, though difficulty is part of it, but the sense of facing someone who is genuinely formidable and who has earned their position through capability rather than narrative convenience. The development of the game's musical scores deserves particular attention in any account of how the regions have evolved. Junichi Masuda, who composed the music for the original games and has remained involved with the franchise's musical direction throughout its history, established a compositional approach in the first generation that used the Game Boy's limited audio capabilities to create melodies that were nonetheless memorable and emotionally appropriate to their contexts. The route themes of Kanto, the town themes, the battle music, all of these established musical archetypes that subsequent composers have worked within and against. The evolution of the franchise's musical language across generations reflects both technical expansion and aesthetic maturation. The move to cartridge-based synthesis allowed for richer arrangements. The move to the DS allowed for stereo sound and more complex orchestration. The 3DS era introduced fully orchestrated arrangements for certain significant tracks. The Switch era allowed for the highest production values the franchise had yet achieved. Through all of these technical changes, the franchise's musical identity has remained remarkably consistent, bright when brightness is called for, melancholy when the narrative requires it, and always prioritizing memorable melody over harmonic complexity. The soundtrack of each region creates a sonic map of the game world that players carry with them after they have set down the controller. Many players who encounter the music of a Pokémon region years after their initial playthrough report immediate and vivid memories of specific locations, specific battles, specific emotional moments in their personal history with the game. The music functions as a kind of archive, encoding the experience of a region in a form that can be retrieved through hearing alone, independent of any other stimulus. The development of Pokemon's competitive dimension, the systems that allow players to battle each other with carefully constructed teams, has run parallel to the development of the single-player game experience throughout the franchise's history. The competitive community, which began informally among players using the link cable in the original Game Boy era, grew into a structured competitive scene with official tournaments, regional and national championships, and a world championship event that draws competitors from across the globe. The development teams have engaged with this competitive dimension in ways that have evolved considerably across generations. Early games were developed without systematic attention to competitive balance, and the competitive community developed practices, most famously the standard of play known as Smogon, that organized the chaos of the game's competitive potential into manageable structures. Later games showed increasing awareness of competitive considerations in their mechanical design, with abilities, move pools, and stat distributions, reflecting a more sophisticated understanding of how the game's systems interact in a competitive context. The VGC, or Video Game Championship, format established by the Pokémon Company as the official standard for organized play, differs from the community Smogon formats in several important ways, most notably in using double battles as the standard format rather than singles. This choice has shaped the competitive development of the franchise in its official dimension, favoring Pokémon and strategies that perform well in the double battle format, and creating a competitive metagame that is distinct from but related to the singles formats favored by the community. The development of the handshake between single player and competitive experience has been one of the franchise's ongoing creative challenges. A game that is perfectly balanced for competitive play might sacrifice narrative coherence or single-player engagement. A game optimized for the single-player experience might create competitive imbalances that damage the longevity of the competitive scene. The teams that have developed each region have navigated this tension with varying degrees of success, and the community's ongoing conversation about that navigation is itself one of the more interesting aspects of the franchise's cultural life. The Mystery Dungeon spin-off games, developed by Chunsoft and later Spike Chunsoft rather than Game Freak, deserve mention in any comprehensive account of the franchise's development history, because they have consistently explored thematic territory that the mainline games have approached more cautiously. The Mystery Dungeon games, which place the player in the role of a human who has been transformed into a Pokémon, have engaged with questions of memory, identity, loss, and sacrifice in ways that have made them unexpectedly emotionally resonant for players who might have approached them as simple spin-offs. The Pokémon Ranger games, the conquest game that combined Pokémon with the tactical RPG mechanics of Nobunaga's Ambition, the Colosseum, and XD games that presented a darker vision of the Pokémon world, in which Pokémon could be corrupted and used against their will. All of these spin-offs have explored aspects of the Pokémon universe that the mainline games have not engaged with directly. They constitute an expanded conception of what the Pokemon world contains and what kinds of stories it is capable of telling. The development of Pokemon Go, released in 2016, represented the most significant expansion of the franchise's reach since its initial global success in the late 1990s. Go placed augmented reality Pokemon catching in the physical world, requiring players to move through their actual environments to encounter and catch Pokemon, to visit Pokestops at real world landmarks, and to participate in raids and events that required physical co presence with other players. The game brought many players who had not engaged with the franchise in years back into contact with Pokemon and introduced the franchise to many who had never played the mainline games. The development of Pokemon Legends, Arceus, released in 2022, represented Game Freak's most significant departure from the mainline franchise structure in the series' history. Set in a historical version of the Sinnoh region called the Hisui region, in a period long before the events of Diamond and Pearl Legends, Arceus placed the player in the role of a member of a survey corps whose task was to create the first Pokedex, studying Pokemon in their natural habitat rather than battling and catching them in the conventional manner. The game introduced new mechanics for sneaking and approaching wild Pokemon, new crafting systems, and a more open world structure than any previous mainline game. The Hisui region's relationship to the familiar Sinnoh geography created a particular kind of pleasure for players familiar with Diamond and Pearl. The recognition of familiar landmarks in their historical states, the identification of ancestors of familiar Pokemon in their regional variants, the gradual assembly of a picture of how the world of Diamond and Pearl came to be from the raw material of Hisui's wilder, less organized landscape. The game demonstrated that the franchise's established regions contained more narrative potential than the mainline games had yet exhausted, and suggested that historical settings might become a significant part of the franchise's future development. The question of what comes next for the franchise, what regions remain to be created, and what creative challenges the development teams will set themselves in future generations is genuinely open. The franchise has shown remarkable resilience across its history, finding ways to renew itself while maintaining the core experience that has made it beloved across multiple generations of players. Each new region has been an argument about what Pokemon can be, and that argument has never settled into a final answer. The development history of every Pokemon region is ultimately the history of a creative aspiration that began with one person's memory of catching insects in a field that no longer exists. That aspiration has been realized through the work of many hundreds of people across 3 decades, each of whom has contributed something to the world that players inhabit when they step into the tall grass for the first time. The regions of Kanto and Johto, and Hoenn and Sinnoh, and Unova, and Kalos and Alola, and Galar and Paldea are the accumulated residue of that work, places that feel real to people who have never visited them, creatures that feel alive to people who have never seen them. There is something worth pausing on in that particular achievement: the ability to create a world that feels genuinely inhabited, that carries the emotional weight of a real place even while being entirely fictional, is not a common accomplishment. It requires not just technical skill, but a kind of collective imaginative commitment that sustains itself across years of development and decades of player engagement. The regions of the Pokemon world have sustained that commitment across a span of time that has carried many of their original players from childhood through adolescence and into adult life. Players who caught their first Pidgey in the tall grass outside Pallet Town as children are now, in many cases, parents themselves, introducing the franchise to a new generation of players who are discovering for the first time the particular pleasure of stepping into a world that seems to have existed before you arrived and will continue to exist after you set it down. That sense of a world with a life independent of the player's engagement is one of the hardest things to achieve in game design, and the Pokemon franchise has achieved it with a consistency that is genuinely remarkable when examined across the full sweep of its development history. The regions will continue to be made. New development teams, perhaps including people who grew up playing the very games their predecessors created, will find new real world inspirations and new mechanical innovations and new narrative ambitions. They will inherit the constraints and the freedoms that the franchise's history has established, and they will work within that inheritance to create something that feels both continuous with what came before and genuinely new. Whatever they make, it will carry within it the traces of what preceded it, the emotional logic of the original Pokemon Red and Blue, the mythological ambition of Sinnoh, the regional warmth of Alola, the open world freedom of Paldea. The development history of Pokemon regions is not a straight line of progress, but a conversation across generations, each new entry responding to and building upon everything that came before it, the whole of it constituting something richer and more interesting than any individual part. The development of each Pokemon game's art direction deserves more careful attention than it typically receives in discussions of the franchise. The transition from the original Game Boy's pixel art to the more detailed sprites of the Game Boy Color, then to the Game Boy Advance's richer palette, then to the DS's dual-screen setup and its ability to display more detailed environments, and finally to the 3DS's three-dimensional character models. Each of these shifts required the art teams to reconsider fundamental questions about what Pokemon and their world should look like. Ken Sugimori, who designed almost all of the original 151 Pokemon himself using marker pens on paper before the designs were digitized, established an aesthetic that has proven remarkably flexible across multiple visual translations. The simple, bold outlines of his original designs encoded design principles, strong silhouette, clear color differentiation, visual legibility at small sizes that remained applicable even when the medium shifted from pixel art to polygonal modeling. A Pikachu drawn by Sugimori on paper and a Pikachu rendered in 3 dimensions for a Switch game are recognizably the same design expressed in different technologies. The design of new Pokemon for each generation has always been a collaborative process, but the nature and scale of that collaboration has changed considerably. In the original games, Sugimori did most of the design work himself. As the franchise grew and the development teams expanded, more designers contributed to each generation's roster. The design philosophy, documented in interviews with Sugimori and other members of the creative team, emphasizes the importance of designs that communicate a clear concept at a glance, that feel like they could exist as living creatures, and that offer the player something to discover beyond the initial impression. The development of the Pokédex entries for each Pokemon, the short descriptive texts that appear when a player registers a new Pokemon, represents one of the franchise's most underappreciated creative dimensions. These entries, rarely more than 2 or 3 sentences long, are asked to do a great deal of work. They must establish what a Pokemon is, hint at its personality and behavior, sometimes add a touch of the uncanny or the wondrous, and leave the player wanting to know more. The best entries achieve a kind of concise world building that rivals the descriptive economy of the best flash fiction. The development of the game's localization, the process of translating not just the text, but the cultural content of each game into forms that would resonate with international audiences, has been another of the franchise's persistent creative challenges. The original game's localization from Japanese to English required the renaming of most Pokemon and many locations, a process that involved coining English language names that captured the spirit of the Japanese originals while working within the phonological constraints of English. Some of these English names have become so thoroughly established in the franchise's global identity that it is difficult to remember that they were created through a process of deliberate invention rather than always having existed. The naming conventions for Pokemon vary across generations and across languages, reflecting different approaches to the balance between linguistic creativity and communicative clarity. Some names are puns or portmanteaus, combining words in ways that hint at the Pokemon's nature or appearance. Others are adaptations of words from non English languages, often Japanese, but sometimes drawing on Latin, Greek, or other sources. Others still are essentially invented words, combinations of sounds that feel appropriate to the Pokemon's character without having any specific linguistic derivation. The richness of Pokemon naming across the franchise's history represents a significant body of creative linguistic work that deserves more attention than it typically receives. The development of the game's sound design, beyond the musical scores that typically receive more attention, has been an important contributor to each region's atmosphere. The cries of Pokemon, the sounds they make when encountered in battle or in the overworld, have been a distinctive element of the franchise since the beginning. The original Game Boy could produce only simple electronic sounds, and the Pokemon cries of the first generation reflected those limitations in ways that became iconic. The evolution of Pokemon cries across generations, from simple waveforms to more elaborate sound designs, has been a gradual process that the development teams have navigated carefully, aware that the cries of beloved Pokemon from earlier generations had acquired a kind of emotional significance that made dramatic revision risky. The development of the game's narrative complexity has followed a trajectory broadly similar to the development of the game's mechanical complexity. Starting from a relatively simple baseline and adding sophistication over time, though the additions have been made in different ways at different points and have not followed a strictly linear progression. The original games had essentially no narrative beyond the premise of the journey and the implicit contest with the rival. Team Rocket, as the villainous organization, served primarily as a series of obstacles rather than as a coherent narrative presence. The motivation for defeating Team Rocket was never more specific than the general sense that they were doing something wrong. By the time of Diamond and Pearl and their engagement with Team Galactic's nihilistic agenda, the franchise had developed the capacity to present genuinely complex antagonists with coherent philosophies. N in Black and White raised the moral stakes of the franchise's central premise in ways that required the player to genuinely engage with a counter-argument rather than simply defeating an obstacle. Lysandra in X and Y provided an antagonist whose arc moved from apparent idealism to devastating destructiveness in ways that had real narrative weight. Each of these developments extended the emotional range that the Pokemon games could operate in without abandoning the core experience that made them accessible to young players. The development of the game's approach to difficulty is another area where significant changes are visible across generations. The original games were not designed with explicit difficulty adjustment in mind, and their challenge level reflected the expectations of the late 1990s Japanese game market, which assumed a degree of patience and tolerance for trial and error that later became less standard. Players who encountered the original games as children and did not initially succeed at certain challenges often returned to them with persistence, in part because there was no alternative, and in part because the reward for persistence was genuinely satisfying. Later games introduced features, most notably the experience share item and its various iterations, that distributed experience points more widely across the player's team and effectively reduced the degree to which underleveled team members could create difficulty spikes. The community's response to these changes has been divided, with some players appreciating the smoother progression and others feeling that the reduction of difficulty diminished the sense of achievement. This ongoing conversation about difficulty is itself a reflection of the franchise's broadening audience. A game series that began with a primary audience of children has grown to include adults who have been playing for decades and who bring very different expectations to each new entry. The development of the GTS, the global trade system, and its successors introduced the possibility of Pokemon trading with players anywhere in the world, removing the requirement for physical proximity that the link cable and local wireless systems had imposed. This change transformed the social dimension of the Pokemon experience. Instead of trading Pokemon with friends at school or at a local club meeting, players could now engage with a global community of trainers, potentially finding any Pokemon they wanted from a player on the other side of the world. The GTS and its successors have been the subject of ongoing design work as the franchise has tried to create trading systems that are both accessible and resistant to the exploitative practices, requesting rare Pokemon for common ones in exchange requests that would never be completed, that have sometimes undermined the community's goodwill toward the system. The development of the franchise's relationship with competitive battling has been one of its most complex, ongoing negotiations. The original games were not designed with competitive play in mind, and the practices that emerged from the competitive community, breeding for specific individual values and effort values, training Pokemon to maximize particular stats, assembling teams based on careful analysis of type matchups and ability interactions. All of these were developed by players working within systems that the developers had not explicitly designed for this use. The developers' response to the emergence of competitive play has been gradually to make the game's systems more transparent and accessible to competitive players, while maintaining the single-player experience that remains the primary mode of engagement for much of the audience. The development of online features across generations reflects the broader history of online gaming and the specific constraints of the Nintendo platforms on which the games have appeared. The DS-era Wi-Fi connection, the 3DS Street Pass and Spot Pass features, the Switch Online subscription service, each of these represented different technical and social infrastructures for connecting players, and the game features built on top of these infrastructures reflected the possibilities and limitations of each. The discontinuation of the DAS Wi-Fi connection in 2014, which rendered many online features of games from the DS era permanently non-functional, was a reminder of the fragility of online features compared to the durability of single-player content. The development of Pokémon Home, the cloud-based Pokémon storage and trading service introduced in 2020, represented an attempt to create a permanent infrastructure for carrying Pokémon forward across game generations, addressing one of the franchise's longest-standing frustrations, the difficulty of transferring Pokémon from older games to newer ones. The complex chain of transfer applications and services required to move a Pokémon from the original Game Boy games to the current generation reflected the absence of a coherent long-term strategy for Pokémon portability, and Pokémon Home represented an attempt to establish a more stable foundation going forward. The development of the franchise's merchandise, anime, trading card game, and other media alongside the games has created a complex ecosystem in which different products reinforce and expand each other. The anime, which began airing in 1997 in Japan and 1998 internationally, introduced the character of Ash Ketchum and his Pikachu to audiences who might never have played the games, and the popularity of that pairing shaped the franchise's identity in ways that extended back into the game development process. The trading card game, launched in Japan in 1996, created its own dimension of engagement with Pokémon that operated largely independently of the game's mechanics, while drawing on the same pool of creatures and designs. The development of the gym badge system as the primary progression marker in most mainline games reflects a choice about what kind of achievement should be visible and portable. Gym badges, displayed in the player's trainer card, served as a record of accomplishment that could be shown to other players and that communicated the stage of the player's progress through the game's narrative. The replacement of this system in Alola with the Grand Trial victories and the different structures of Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet reflected ongoing experimentation with what the primary marker of progress should be and what kind of emotional weight it should carry. The development of the franchise's environmental storytelling, the way the games communicate the history and character of their regions through the placement of objects, the dialogue of minor NPCs, the backstories embedded in Pokédex entries and item descriptions, has become increasingly sophisticated over the franchise's history. The original games contained environmental storytelling, primarily in the form of NPC dialogue that revealed fragments of the game world's history or commented on the player's progress. Later games embedded more elaborate backstories in the landscape itself, in ruins that could only be partially deciphered, in buildings whose state of decay or abandonment implied histories that the game never made fully explicit. The development of villain organizations across the franchise shows a consistent effort to give each generation's antagonists a distinctive philosophy and motivation that reflects the region's particular thematic concerns. Team Rocket's profit-driven criminal enterprise reflected Kanto's pragmatic, modernizing character. Team Aqua and Team Magma's opposed visions as of natural restoration reflected Hoenn's environmental themes. Team Galactic's nihilistic ambition to unmake the universe reflected Sinnoh's cosmological scope. Team Plasma's professed concern for Pokémon liberation, which concealed Ghetsis' ambition for personal power, reflected Unova's engagement with moral complexity. Each of these organizations was designed to be a coherent expression of the region's theme, rather than simply a generic obstacle. The development of rival characters across generations shows a shift from antagonism to complexity, from simple competitors who dismiss the player to more nuanced figures with their own struggles and growth arcs. The rivals of later generations, Barry and Sinnoh, Hugh and Unova, Hau and Alola, each brought something different to the role. Barry's frantic energy, Hugh's fierce protectiveness of his sister's stolen Pokémon, Hau's cheerful determination to improve. These characters were developed as companions in the player's journey rather than simply as benchmarks of progress, and the shift required that the rivals' appearances throughout the game be scripted with more care for narrative continuity and emotional development. The development of the Pokémon world's human societies, the cultures and economies and social structures that exist alongside the Pokémon ecosystem, has been a dimension of the franchise that has received increasing attention as the games have grown more ambitious in their world building. The original games sketched a world in which humans and Pokémon coexisted in a relationship primarily defined by training and battle, with the deeper social implications of that coexistence left largely unexplored. Later games have introduced more texture, the Ranger organization's different relationship to Pokémon, Pokémon contests' cultural dimension, the role of legendary Pokémon in regional mythology and religion, the economic structures that support Pokémon training as a primary profession. The development of legendary Pokémon design has followed the broader arc of the franchise's design philosophy, starting from relatively simple concepts and gradually incorporating more complex thematic and mythological content. The original legendary birds and Mewtwo established the template of powerful creatures existing at the margins of the game's world, requiring specific knowledge or abilities to access. Later legendary designs incorporated more elaborate backstories, more complex mythological roles, and more specific ecological or cosmological functions. The legendary Pokémon of Sinnoh, Kalos, and Alola, in particular, represent some of the most ambitious attempts to use Pokémon design to engage with fundamental questions about existence, time, life, and destruction. The development of pseudo-legendary Pokémon, the group of exceptionally powerful non-legendary species that each generation has included, beginning with Dragonite in Kanto and extending through Tyranitar, Salamence, Metagross, Garchomp, Hydreigon, Goodra, Kamo-O, Dragapult, and Baxcalibur, has created a consistent design tradition of powerful, late game species with three-stage evolutionary lines and high base stat totals. These Pokemon often serve as the visual and mechanical apex of their generation's non legendary design, and are frequently the subject of intense community attention and competitive play. Their design reflects both the creative ambitions of each generation's art team and the competitive community's interest in powerful, flexible battlers. The development of Pokemon centers, the healing locations distributed throughout each region's towns and cities, as both a mechanical convenience and a narrative environment deserves attention. Pokemon centers have always been more than simply healing stations. They have served as social hubs, communication points, and in the DS and 3DS eras, as the primary interface for the game's wireless and online features. The design of Pokemon centers has evolved across generations to reflect the changing social functions they serve, while the presence of Nurse Joy, who appears in essentially every Pokemon Center in the mainline games, has become one of the franchise's most durable recurring figures. The development of HM mechanics, the system by which certain Pokemon moves could be used outside of battle to navigate the game world, from surf for crossing water to fly for fast travel to cut for removing obstacles, represents one of the franchise's most consequential and most discussed design choices. The HM system, present from the original games through Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, required players to either teach their Pokemon HM moves, which occupied move slots and could not easily be unlearned, or to maintain dedicated HM users alongside their primary team. The design tension created by this requirement, the conflict between optimizing a team for battle and ensuring it could navigate the game world, was experienced differently by different players. Some found it an interesting constraint that shaped team composition decisions. Others found it an annoying limitation that cluttered their teams with unwanted moves. The gradual relaxation of the HM requirement across later generations, from the Pokemon Sun and Moon replacement of HMs with the Poke Ride system to the rideable legendaries of Scarlet and Violet, reflected an evolving understanding of what the HM system had been trying to accomplish and what alternatives might achieve the same ends without the drawbacks. The feeling of unlocking a new area of the game world when a required HM becomes accessible, one of the oldest and most satisfying feelings in adventure game design, has been preserved in various forms, even as the specific HM mechanics have been revised or removed. The development of the game's post-game content, the activities and challenges available after the main story's completion, has become increasingly important as the game's audience has expanded to include more dedicated players who exhaust the main game quickly and want additional challenges. The Battle Tower, which appeared in Gold and Silver and has appeared in various forms in subsequent games, provides a structured competitive challenge that scales indefinitely, testing the player's team building and strategic abilities against a series of increasingly difficult opponents. Later post-game editions have included legendary Pokemon hunts, competitive battle facilities, and story expansions that reveal additional narrative content. The development of shiny Pokemon, alternate colored variants of existing species that appear at very low probability in the wild and can be obtained through breeding or specific in-game methods, has created one of the franchise's most persistent forms of long-term engagement. The probability of encountering a shiny Pokemon in the wild has varied across generations, from roughly 1 in 8,000 in the original games to higher rates in games that introduced shiny hunting mechanics or chain-based methods. The community of shiny hunters who dedicate hours or days to encountering specific shiny Pokemon represents one of the more specialized but deeply committed segments of the franchise's audience. The development of the game's difficulty in relation to the player's age and experience is a challenge that the franchise has addressed imperfectly across its history. A franchise that begins as primarily aimed at children and retains that audience as they grow into adults, must continually navigate the tension between accessibility for new young players and satisfaction for experienced adult players. The franchise's current approach, which generally errs on the side of accessibility, has been a source of ongoing community discussion about whether the games have become too easy for their adult audience. The development of the franchise's relationship to speedrunning, the community practice of completing games as quickly as possible using various optimization techniques, has created an interesting secondary cultural dimension. Pokemon speedrunning communities have developed highly sophisticated techniques for minimizing the time required to complete each game, techniques that often reveal aspects of the game's programming and design that the developers did not intend to be visible. The relationship between speedrunners and the game's developers has generally been one of mutual curiosity rather than antagonism, with the speedrunning community's discoveries occasionally informing the developers' understanding of their own games. The development of the Pokemon franchise's educational and scientific engagement, including collaborations with real biologists, ecologists, and other scientists who have written about the ways in which Pokemon designs reflect and diverge from real-world biological knowledge, has created a productive relationship between the games and scientific inquiry. Papers published in scientific journals have analyzed the ecological plausibility of Pokemon ecosystems, the evolutionary biology implied by Pokemon type distributions, and the neurological models that might underlie Pokemon abilities. This engagement reflects the franchise's unexpected depth as a cultural artifact with genuine connections to scientific concepts. The development of each region's map as a designed object, a piece of visual communication that conveys the region's geography, atmosphere, and navigational logic in a single image, has been another of the franchise's consistent creative accomplishments. The maps of all Pokemon regions are legible and aesthetically coherent, conveying the feel of each region through color palette, topographic detail, and the visual rhythm of their features. The iconic shape of each region's map, Kanto's compact grid, Johto's more flowing contours, Sinnoh's central mountain dividing the east from the west, has become part of the franchise's visual vocabulary, recognizable to players even without labels. The development of Pokémon as a global cultural phenomenon with engaged communities in Japan, North America, Europe, Australia, and every other region with access to the games, has shaped the franchise's development in ways that are not always visible in the games themselves, but that have influenced countless decisions about which ideas to pursue and which to set aside. The franchise's developers work with an awareness of how their choices will land with audiences across different cultural contexts, and that awareness has produced a franchise that, at its best, manages to feel both distinctly Japanese in its cultural roots and genuinely accessible to audiences from very different backgrounds. The development of the franchise's future remains genuinely uncertain in the most interesting possible sense. Uncertain not because the franchise is in trouble, but because it continues to generate creative possibilities at a rate that makes prediction genuinely difficult. The combination of open-world design, historical settings, regional variants, complex mythologies, competitive depth, and ongoing technological advancement creates a design space that seems likely to generate new and interesting Pokemon regions for many years to come. Each region will be, as all the ones before it have been, a new argument about what Pokemon can be and what a Pokemon region should feel like, and that argument shows no signs of reaching a final answer. The regions of the Pokemon world are not simply backgrounds for adventure or containers for collectible creatures. They are expressions of a creative team's understanding of what kind of world is worth inhabiting and what kind of journey is worth taking. They carry the traces of the people who made them and the times in which they were made. They encode the values of their creators, the wonder that the original vision sought to recreate, the respect for nature and tradition that Johto expressed, the environmental concern that Hoenn embedded in its conflict, the mythological ambition that Sinnoh demonstrated, the moral seriousness that Unova attempted. And they carry something else, something harder to name but no less real, the accumulated experience of the many millions of players who have inhabited them, who have carried their teams through their routes and their towns, who have formed attachments to the creatures they found there, and the rivals they faced, and the champions they eventually defeated. The regions are, in a very real sense, shared imaginative spaces, places that exist in the collective memory of a community and that have shaped the inner lives of people who have never met each other, but who share the experience of having been there. The grass was tall, and the path was long, and somewhere in the quiet of that journey, something happened that was worth remembering. That is where every Pokemon region begins, and where, in the most important sense, every one of them still resides. The quieter details of each region's development often illuminate the larger picture more clearly than the headline features. The way a single town was designed, for instance, the decision to make Lavender Town in Kanto a place of mourning, with its Pokemon Tower housing the graves of departed creatures, established something about the game's emotional range that its cheerful surface might not have suggested. The Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town told players that this world took loss seriously, that the bonds between Pokemon and their trainers had weight and consequence, and that death was not simply an absence, but a presence that the living had to find ways to carry. The way the Safari Zone was designed in Kanto, as an area where the normal rules of the game did not apply, where Pokemon could not simply be battled into submission before being caught, created a specific kind of tension and unpredictability that contrasted productively with the more controlled experience of the rest of the game. Players could throw bait or rocks, they could use safari balls, but they could not use their own Pokemon to weaken the target. The Safari Zone's creatures could flee, could be scared away, could ignore everything the player tried. This loss of control was, in its own way, a lesson about the game's world, that not every creature was waiting to be caught, that wildness was a real quality and not merely a game state. These smaller design decisions, accumulated across decades and across all the regions, constitute a philosophy of game design that has rarely been made entirely explicit, but that gives the franchise its distinctive character. That character, at its core, is one of patient wonder, of the conviction that the world rewards those who look carefully and who are willing to give their attention to things that do not immediately announce their importance. It is, in the deepest sense, still the philosophy of the child who found something living under a stone in a field that no longer exists. There is one more thread worth following before this journey finally settles into stillness. The development history of every Pokemon region is not only the history of games being made, but also the history of players growing up inside those games, and the two histories are not separable in any clean way. The regions that Game Freak has created over nearly 30 years have been inhabited, in the most meaningful sense, by the players who have spent time in them, and those players have carried the regions with them into lives that extend far beyond the console or the handheld screen. The child who explored Kanto in 1999 and is now a parent who introduces their own child to the franchise is not simply passing on a product. They are passing on a way of being in a certain kind of world, a set of habits and pleasures and expectations that were formed in the tall grass and the caves and the towns of a place that never physically existed. The regions of Pokemon have shaped how certain people think about exploration, about collection, about the relationships between creatures and the people who care for them. That shaping is the franchise's quietest and most significant achievement, more durable than any sales record or cultural milestone, more real than any rendering technique or mechanical innovation. The regions endure not because they are preserved on cartridges or in cloud storage, but because they are preserved in the minds of the people who walked through them, who can still hear the music of a particular route or feel the satisfaction of a particular catch, who carry those experiences as part of their understanding of what the world can feel like when it is, for a time, genuinely full of wonder. The design philosophy that has guided the development of every Pokemon region shares certain qualities that are worth naming one final time before rest fully arrives. Restraint is one of them. The understanding that a world gains depth not by packing in as much as possible, but by carefully selecting what to include and allowing what is included to breathe. Each region that has succeeded has done so partly because of what it did not contain as much as because of what it did. The creative discipline required to say no to ideas that are interesting in isolation but wrong for the whole is one of the hardest skills in collaborative design, and the history of the franchise's regions is in part a history of that discipline being exercised, sometimes successfully and sometimes not, across many years of creative work. Generosity is another of those qualities, the willingness to give players more than they strictly need, to fill the world with details that serve no mechanical purpose, but that make the experience of being in that world richer and stranger and more worth returning to. The NPC who has a single line of dialogue that hints at a whole life the player will never see, the Pokédex entry that describes behavior no mechanic in the game will ever represent, the room in a house that contains objects whose significance is never explained. All of these are acts of creative generosity, and they accumulate into the sense that the game world is genuinely inhabited rather than simply staged for the player's benefit. And wonder, finally, which is both the most obvious and the most difficult to sustain. The quality that Satoshi Tajiri was reaching for when he thought about catching insects in a field that no longer existed, the quality that has made Pokemon regions feel like places worth visiting, even after you know everything they contain. Wonder does not require novelty, though novelty can produce it. It requires instead a certain quality of attention, a design sensibility that understands what it is like to encounter something for the first time and tries to recreate that experience for each new player who arrives. Every generation's designers have attempted to create that experience anew, and the best of them have succeeded in ways that their players have never forgotten. The regions of Pokémon are, finally, an argument about what the world can feel like when it is designed with care and curiosity, and a genuine belief that the person who will experience it deserves something worth experiencing. That argument has been made, region by region, across nearly 3 decades, and it shows no sign of ending. The relationship between each Pokémon region and the real-world geography that inspired it is one of the most consistently rewarding threads to follow through the franchise's development history. The translation from real place to game region is never direct, never simply a matter of reproducing the contours of a coastline or the layout of a city. It is instead a kind of creative distillation, a process by which the designers identify the emotional essence of a real environment, the qualities that make it feel distinctive and worth inhabiting, and then build a game world that evokes those qualities without being constrained by geographical accuracy. Kanto's relationship to the real Kanto region of Japan is loose but genuine. The flatness of the Kanto plain, hemmed in by mountains to the north and west, and open to the sea to the south and east, finds an echo in the game's geography. The sense of being in a place that is modern and connected, that has train lines and cities with specialisms and a certain pragmatic energy, comes through in the way the game world is organized. Pallet Town is small and quiet, but it is not rural in any deep sense. It exists within reach of the urban world, and the journey outward from it feels less like an escape into wilderness than an exploration of a world that is already largely organized by human activity. Johto's relationship to the Kansai region, by contrast, is a relationship to a place defined by its consciousness of its own history. Kyoto, the city that served most directly as the model for aquatic, has been the cultural capital of Japan for over a millennium, and it carries that weight in ways that are visible in its architecture and in the attitudes of the people who live there. The game designers who drew on Kansai for Johto We're drawing on this sense of historical weight, of a place that knows it is old and has made peace with that knowledge, that finds value in continuity rather than in newness. It critiques Tin Tower and Burned Tower, the one still standing and housing a legendary creature, the other collapsed and serving as a reminder of catastrophe, embody this quality of historical consciousness more precisely than any other location in the franchise. Hoenn's relationship to Kyushu is warmer and less weighted with historical consciousness. Kyushu is known in Japan as a place of natural beauty and warmth, of good food and hot springs, and a certain openness of character that differs from the more guarded temperament associated with other regions. The game's version of this translates into a world that feels genuinely welcoming, that does not ask you to earn your place in it before allowing you to enjoy it, that offers beautiful coastal vistas and rich underwater environments as gifts rather than rewards. The warmth of Hoenn's aesthetic, its colors, and its music, and the particular quality of its NPCs as dialogue, owes something real to the warmth of Kyushu's cultural character. Sinnoh's relationship to Hokkaido is a relationship to cold and to the particular kind of beauty that cold landscapes produce. Hokkaido is Japan's frontier, the island that was settled latest, and that retains a sense of being somewhat outside the mainstream of Japanese culture, with its indigenous Ainu traditions, and its vast open spaces, and its winters that are genuinely severe by Japanese standards. The game's version of this translates into a world that feels both expansive and inhospitable, where the landscape itself presents challenges that the other regions do not, and where the sense of being at the edge of something, of standing on the frontier of what is known, is part of the emotional experience from the beginning. Unova's relationship to New York City is the franchise's most explicit engagement with a non-Japanese real-world location, and it is worth considering what that choice signaled at the time. New York City is not simply a place. It is an idea about what a city can be, dense and various, full of people from everywhere doing things that have no precedent, a machine for the generation of novelty and the collision of cultures. The game's version of New York captures some of this quality in Castelia City, the game's towering urban hub, which feels genuinely different from any previous Pokémon city, more vertical and more anonymous, and more full of the particular energy that comes from density. The rest of Unova extends this urban character into a broader landscape that is recognizably American in its scale and its visual vocabulary, even if the specific references are seldom literal. Kalos's relationship to France is the franchise's most aesthetically self-conscious engagement with a real-world location. France, and Paris in particular, is associated internationally with a specific set of aesthetic values: elegance, refinement, a particular relationship to beauty as something cultivated and displayed rather than simply experienced. The game designers drew on these values to create a region that feels more deliberately beautiful than any that came before, in which the aesthetic quality of environments is itself part of what the game is communicating. Lumiose City's design, with its radial boulevards extending from a central tower that evokes the Eiffel Tower without being it, is the clearest expression of this aesthetic ambition, but it runs through the entire region, from the coastal elegance of Umbrette Town to the ancient melancholy of the war memorial sites. Alola's relationship to Hawaii is the franchise's most culturally engaged, in the sense of taking most seriously the obligation to represent a living culture with some degree of fidelity and respect. Hawaii is not simply a beautiful place. It is a place with a specific history of colonization and cultural survival, with indigenous traditions that have been suppressed and revived and are now a matter of genuine community pride. The game's engagement with Hawaiian culture, through the island challenge system, through the role of the kahunas, through the presence of Pokémon that have adapted to island life in ways that parallel real ecological processes, reflects a degree of research and care that previous regional inspirations had not quite required. Galar's relationship to the United Kingdom is the most layered and perhaps the most affectionate of the franchise's regional inspirations. The United Kingdom is a country with an extremely complex relationship to its own history, one that is simultaneously deeply proud of a long tradition of cultural achievement and deeply uncomfortable with the darker aspects of the imperial history that partly funded that achievement. The game's version of the United Kingdom emphasizes the comfortable and the celebratory aspects, the rolling countryside, the great sporting tradition, the particular pleasure of a culture that takes competitive endeavor seriously while also taking tea seriously. Wyndon, the game's equivalent of London, feels like the London of a certain kind of affectionate imagination, rather than the London of anyone's actual daily experience. Paldea's relationship to the Iberian Peninsula, and particularly to Spain, engages with a culture that is in some ways the most physically dramatic of all the franchise's real-world inspirations. Spain's landscape is extraordinarily varied. The green coastlines of the north, the high arid plateau of the central Meseta, the subtropical warmth of Andalusia, the volcanic drama of the Canary Islands. The game's version of this variety is expressed through a map that encompasses genuine climatic diversity within a single region, from snow-capped mountains in the north to warm coastal areas in the south with a central depression, the Paldean equivalent of the real Meseta, that functions as the geographical and thematic heart of the game's world. The development of each generation's music deserves far more careful attention than it typically receives in discussions of the franchise's history. Music is that element of game experience that operates most directly on the emotional register, that shapes how a player feels about a location or a moment without requiring them to consciously process or interpret anything. The composers who have worked on the Pokémon franchise have been creating music that players carry with them for decades, music that can trigger vivid and specific memories of places that never existed, and they have done this across 9 generations of games with a consistency and a quality that represents one of the most remarkable bodies of work in game music history. Junichi Masuda composed the music for the original Pokémon games under conditions that were genuinely difficult. The Game Boy's sound chip offered only 4 audio channels, 2 pulse wave channels, 1 wave channel, and 1 noise channel, which meant that everything Masuda wrote had to be rendered in a form that could be expressed through those 4 voices simultaneously. The constraints were not simply technical, but aesthetic. Melodies had to be strong enough to be recognizable and emotionally effective without harmonic support. Rhythms had to create energy without the complexity of full percussion, and the overall sonic identity of the game had to cohere across dozens of individual tracks, from the gentle looping themes of small towns to the urgent battle music and the triumphant flourishes of gym victories. The result, which Masuda achieved, is a body of music that succeeded under those constraints in ways that continue to resonate. The Pallet Town theme, which opens the game and establishes the player's home base, is perhaps the simplest piece of music in the franchise's history, a gentle repeated figure that conveys both domesticity and the promise of departure. The Route 1 theme, which begins playing the moment the player steps into the first wild area, transforms that gentleness into something more forward-moving, more energetic, a music that communicates the pleasurable anticipation of a journey whose destination is not yet known. The battle theme of the original games became one of the most recognizable pieces of music in the history of video games, a phrase that is not lightly offered, but that the evidence supports. The main battle theme's opening bars, with their driving rhythmic urgency and their sense of immediate stakes, have been heard by hundreds of millions of people across multiple decades. The theme has been arranged and reorchestrated and remixed more times than can easily be counted, and in each new form it retains the quality of the original, a piece of music that makes you feel the particular excitement of a Pokemon battle, the sense that something important and somewhat unpredictable is about to happen. The transition to the Game Boy Color for Johto's games allowed Masuda and his collaborators to work with a slightly richer sonic palette, and the music of Gold and Silver reflects this expanded range. The Goldenrod City theme, for instance, is warmer and more harmonically complete than anything in the original games, conveying the particular character of the game's largest city, its commercial energy, and its sense of being a place where many different kinds of people converge. The National Park theme, which plays in the area designed around the annual bug catching contest, achieves something more delicate, a piece of music that communicates the particular pleasure of a pastoral afternoon, of being outdoors with time and no particular urgency. The music of Hoenn, composed primarily by Masuda with additional contributions from Go Ichinos, moved the franchise's sonic identity in new directions that were initially somewhat controversial among players who had formed strong attachments to the simpler sound of the earlier games. The Game Boy Advance's audio hardware allowed for richer synthesis, and the composers used this richness to create music that felt more environmentally specific, more tied to the particular character of each location. The Little Root Town theme is softer and more tropical than the Pallet Town theme, communicating the warmth of the region through its tone rather than its melody. The Route 1 equivalent, Route 101, is more leisurely, reflecting a journey that begins in a subtropical environment rather than a temperate one. The development of battle music across the franchise's history shows particularly interesting evolution. The original battle theme established a template of urgency and rhythmic drive that subsequent composers worked with and against. Sinnoh's battle themes, composed primarily by Ichinos and Hitomi Sato, introduced a new level of harmonic sophistication, using chord progressions that were more unexpected and more emotionally complex than anything that had appeared in earlier games. The Champion Cynthia's battle theme, which has become the franchise's most celebrated battle piece, achieves a quality of controlled intensity that perfectly matches the character of the battle itself, building through a long introduction before releasing into a driving main theme that communicates both the gravity and the exhilaration of the encounter. The music of Unova, composed by Masuda, Ichinos, and Shota Kageyama, introduced a new level of thematic consistency, with musical motifs recurring across different tracks to create a sense of the region's music as a coherent score rather than a collection of individual pieces. End's theme, which appears in several different arrangements across the game's narrative, is one of the franchise's most emotionally complex pieces of music, beginning as something simple and almost mechanical and gradually revealing greater emotional depth as the player's understanding of End's character develops. The way the theme transforms across its appearances, gaining warmth and complexity as End's isolation and pain become clearer, is a piece of musical storytelling that has few equivalents in the franchise's history. The music of Kalos, which benefited from the 3DOS's ability to play higher quality audio samples, introduced full orchestral arrangements for certain significant tracks, most notably the legendary battle themes. The music of Alola continued this trend, while also introducing more rhythmically complex elements that reflected the region's Hawaiian inspiration, with percussion patterns and melodic contours that evoked Hawaiian musical traditions without directly quoting them. The development of music that could reference a specific cultural tradition while remaining accessible and emotionally coherent to players from very different musical backgrounds required considerable compositional skill, and the Alola soundtrack achieved it with a consistency that has made it one of the most beloved in the franchise. The music of Galar, composed by Toby Fox alongside the regular Game Freak composers, introduced a new voice into the franchise's musical identity. Fox, known primarily for the independent game Undertale and its soundtrack, brought a compositional approach that prioritized emotional directness and thematic clarity over the more complex harmonic and structural approaches that the Game Freak composers had developed across the franchise's history. The collaboration produced music that felt fresh within the franchise's context, particularly in the battle music for the game's climactic encounters, while maintaining enough continuity with the established sonic identity that it still sounded like a Pokemon game. The music of Scarlet and Violet, composed by Masuda, Ichinose, Kageyama, and new contributors including Minako Adachi, represented perhaps the most ambitious attempt yet to use music to communicate the openness and variety of the new region. An open world game presents particular compositional challenges. The music must function across a much wider range of environments and situations than a more linear game, must transition smoothly between different contexts, and must avoid the repetitiveness that can result from music that loops too frequently in a game where players might spend long periods in any given area. The composers addressed these challenges with layered arrangements that adjusted dynamically to the player's context, adding or removing elements in response to what was happening in the game world. The development of the franchise's monster design philosophy, the principles and processes that have guided the creation of Pokemon across all generations, is one of the richest subjects in the franchise's development history, and one that reveals a great deal about what the creative teams have valued and what they have tried to avoid. The creation of a new Pokemon involves a set of interlocking decisions about concept, about visual design, about type assignment, about evolutionary structure, about name, and about competitive mechanics that must all resolve into a coherent whole. Getting all of those decisions right simultaneously for more than 1,000 individual creatures across 9 generations is an achievement that deserves more acknowledgement than it typically receives. The concept stage of Pokemon design begins with the identification of an inspiration, a real-world animal, a cultural symbol, an object, a natural phenomenon, a mythological figure, sometimes a combination of several of these, that will serve as the foundation for the creature's identity. The choice of inspiration is the most fundamental creative decision in the design process because it determines the range of visual and thematic possibilities that the design can explore. A Pokemon based on a jellyfish will move in certain directions that a Pokemon based on a sword will not. A Pokemon based on a concept from Shinto mythology will carry different associations than one based on a creature from European folklore. The translation of inspiration into design requires the kind of creative transformation that Ken Sugimori has described as the essential skill of Pokemon design, the ability to take something familiar and render it unfamiliar, to find the angle of approach that reveals the inspiration in a new light without losing what made it interesting in the first place. A Pokemon based on a crab that looked exactly like a crab would be less interesting than one that used the crab's defining features, its hard shell, its sideways movement, its claws, in ways that created something that felt simultaneously recognizable and novel. Finding that angle requires both knowledge of the source material and imaginative flexibility, the ability to see the source material from unexpected directions. The role of type in Pokemon design is more complex than it might initially appear. Type determines a Pokemon's strengths and weaknesses in battle, and it shapes the player's expectations about the creature's behavior and abilities. But type also carries aesthetic and thematic associations that influence how a design is perceived. Fire-type Pokemon are expected to feel energetic and slightly dangerous, to communicate heat and intensity. Water-type Pokemon are expected to feel fluid and adaptable, to communicate depth and movement. Psychic-type Pokemon are expected to feel calm and precise, to communicate intelligence and hidden power. These associations, which players have built up across many games and many encounters, create a set of expectations that design teams can fulfill, subvert, or complicate in ways that affect how new Pokemon are received. The evolution structure of a Pokemon, how many stages it passes through, and what those stages represent thematically, is another fundamental design decision with significant creative implications. A single stage Pokemon, one that does not evolve, must be fully realized in a single form, communicating its entire identity through one design. A three-stage evolutionary line has the luxury of distributing thematic content across three designs, using the progression from first to second to third stage to tell a story about growth and transformation or change. The middle stage of a three-stage line is often the most challenging to design well, because it must function as both a recognizable development of the first stage and a convincing foundation for the third, maintaining thematic continuity while also showing meaningful change. Baby Pokemon, the pre-evolutionary forms that Game Freak introduced beginning with Johto, added a fourth possibility to the evolutionary structure, one that could be used to show the creature's existence at an earlier, more vulnerable stage. The design of baby Pokemon is constrained in specific ways. They must be recognizably related to their evolved forms, while also feeling genuinely younger and less developed, which typically means rounder proportions, simpler color schemes, and reduced visual complexity. The best baby Pokemon designs, Togepi, Pichu, Magby, feel like genuine conceptual predecessors to their evolved forms, as though the evolution represents a real developmental process rather than simply an exchange of one design for another. The naming of Pokemon is one of the most linguistically creative dimensions of the design process, and one that has produced some of the franchise's most satisfying moments of wordplay and cultural reference. The Japanese names of Pokemon are typically constructed through combination of Japanese words, with occasional borrowings from other languages, in ways that describe or evoke the creature's nature. The English names and the names in other languages are generally constructed through similar processes adapted to the linguistic constraints and creative traditions of each target language. Some names translate fairly directly, conveying essentially the same meaning in both Japanese and English. Others are constructed independently for each language, with the English name making a different but related wordplay on the creature's concept. The decision about which Pokemon will be available in which games, and in which locations within those games, involves a kind of ecological thinking that the development teams have developed in sophistication across the franchise's history. The placement of Pokemon in specific habitats, tall grass versus caves versus water versus specific times of day, communicates something about each creature's nature that reinforces its design. A Pokemon that appears only at night feels different from one that is present throughout the day, even if no explicit explanation for its nocturnal habits is provided. A Pokemon found exclusively in caves feels different from one that appears in open grassland. These placement decisions shape the player's experience of encountering each creature and contribute to the sense that the game world is an ecosystem with genuine ecological logic, rather than simply a collection of creatures distributed for the player's convenience. The development of held items, introduced in Johto and expanded in every subsequent generation, added another dimension to the Pokemon design space by allowing individual members of a species to have different properties depending on what they were carrying. The choice of held item in competitive play became one of the most significant team-building decisions, allowing players to customize their Pokemon's behavior in ways that went beyond type and move selection. The design of items, many of which are named and described in ways that add flavor to the game worlds, is itself a creative exercise in world building. The presence of specific items in the game's economy communicates something about the world's technology, its culture, and its understanding of how Pokemon biology works. The development of the Pokemon franchise's relationship with its own history, the ways in which later games reference, revisit, and reinterpret the events and characters of earlier games has become one of the most interesting dimensions of the franchise's creative life. The original games presented their world as essentially complete and self-contained, with no suggestion that the events of the game were part of a larger chronological narrative. The introduction of Johto, with its connection to Kanto and its encounter with Red on Mount Silver, established the franchise's capacity for self-reference and began the process of constructing a timeline within which all of the games could be situated. The Pokémon timeline, as it has been developed across many games and clarified through interviews with developers and analysis of in-game texts, is a complex structure that has been subject to considerable community debate and interpretation. The original games and their remakes, Fire Red and Leaf Green, established the earliest period accessible to players. Gold and Silver and their remakes, Heart Gold and Soul Silver, take place 3 years after the events of the original games. Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum appear to take place roughly contemporaneously with Gold and Silver. Black and White are set a generation later, and their sequels 2 years after the original games. X and Y, Sun and Moon, Sword and Shield, and Scarlet and Violet each occupy their own positions in the timeline, connected to earlier games through references and recurring characters, but not always precisely datable relative to each other. The development of this timeline has involved some deliberate narrative choices and some decisions that were made for practical reasons without full consideration of their implications for the timeline's coherence. The presence of Bill's PC system in every region, the existence of the same Pokémon Center design in every game, the recurrence of certain organizations and characters across regions and games, all of these create a sense of the game world as a single connected place with a continuous history, even when the games themselves have not explicitly worked out all of the implications of that continuity. The Looker character, who appears in multiple games beginning with Platinum, is one of the most interesting examples of deliberate cross-game continuity. Looker is an agent of an international police organization who appears in Diamond and Pearl to investigate Team Galactic, then appears in subsequent games to investigate other criminal organizations in other regions. His presence across multiple games suggests a level of coordination between regional authorities that the games do not usually make explicit, and his appearances in later games often carry references to his earlier ones that reward players who have followed his career across generations. The development of the franchise's approach to remakes, the practice of recreating earlier games on newer hardware with updated mechanics and additional content, has raised interesting creative questions about the relationship between original and remake. Fire Red and Leaf Green updated the original Kanto games with Johto-era mechanics and some additional post-game content. Heart Gold and Soul Silver did the same for Gold and Silver, and are widely considered the best remakes the franchise has produced, capturing the essence of the original games while adding enough new content and mechanical improvement to justify the purchase even for players who remembered the originals well. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire updated Hoenn's games with 6th generation mechanics and the addition of the Delta episode, an additional storyline involving the legendary Pokémon Rayquaza that expanded the game's narrative significantly. The remakes of Diamond and Pearl, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl took a different approach, developing near-faithful recreations of the original games with minimal additional content. The community's reception of this approach was divided, with some players appreciating the fidelity to the originals, and others feeling that the opportunity to expand and improve on the Sinnoh games had been partially missed. The contrast between the Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl remakes and the approximately contemporaneous Legends, Arceus, which set itself in the same region with enormous creative ambition, highlighted the different creative possibilities available to remake projects depending on how broadly or narrowly the brief was interpreted. The development of regional game variations, the third versions, and alternate versions that have appeared in most generations, reflects the franchise's commercial strategy as much as its creative ambitions. Pokemon Yellow, the first of these, added content that brought the games into closer alignment with the anime, allowing players to have Pikachu follow them and encounter the three original starters in ways that reflected their anime appearances. Crystal, the third version of Johto, introduced animated Pokemon sprites, an expanded post-game storyline involving the legendary Pokemon Suicune, and the ability to play as a female protagonist for the first time. Emerald, Hoenn's third version, added the Battle Frontier, one of the franchise's most celebrated post-game competitive facilities, and expanded the storyline involving both Team Magma and Team Aqua. Platinum, the third version of Sinnoh's games, made more substantial changes to the base games than any previous third version, adding new areas, reworking the Elite Four's teams, introducing the Distortion World as an extended playable dungeon associated with the legendary Pokemon Giratina, and significantly expanding the Pokédex available during the main game. The scope of Platinum's additions established a new standard for what a third version could accomplish, and its reputation as the definitive Sinnoh experience has persisted strongly enough that the community's desire for a similar treatment of Sword and Shield in the form of a hypothetical Pokemon Shield Plus has been a recurring topic of discussion. Black 2 and White 2, as true sequels rather than enhanced versions of the Unova games, represent a unique position in the franchise's product history. Their narrative continuation of Black and White's storyline, set 2 years after the original games, allowed players to see how the region had changed in the wake of those events, to encounter returning characters in new contexts, and to access areas of Unova that had not been available in the original games. The decision to create genuine sequels rather than a third version was not repeated in subsequent generations, remaining a singular experiment in the franchise's history. The development of the franchise's approach to the post-game, the content accessible after the main storyline's completion, has been another area of consistent creative effort and occasional controversy. The Battle Tower and its various equivalents have appeared across most generations, providing structured competitive challenges that extend the game's engagement possibilities indefinitely. The Battle Frontier, which appeared in Emerald and Platinum, and expanded versions of Heart Gold and Soul Silver, represented the most ambitious version of this concept, offering multiple different competitive facilities with different rules and mechanics, each requiring different team compositions and strategic approaches. The absence of the Battle Frontier from later games, replaced in Sword and Shield by the more limited Battle Tower, was one of the community's most frequent criticisms of the recent games. The development of in-game tournaments, beginning with the Pokemon World Tournament in Black 2 and White 2, extended the post-game in a different direction, allowing players to compete against simulated versions of gym leaders and champions from all previous generations. This feature was received with enormous enthusiasm by players who wanted to see how the champions of different regions would match up against each other, and the battles themselves were designed with enough care to feel like genuine encounters with the characters rather than simply reskins of generic trainers. The feature has not been repeated in subsequent games, remaining another singular experiment in the franchise's history. The development of the franchise's relationship with accessibility, the degree to which players of different ages, experience levels, and physical abilities can engage with the games, has been an ongoing consideration that has produced significant changes across generations. The original games were designed with a primary audience of children in mind, but were not specifically designed to be accessible to players with limited gaming experience or to players with physical disabilities that might affect their ability to use the hardware comfortably. The introduction of the Experience Share, which distributed experience points to the entire party, rather than only the Pokemon that participated in a battle, was one of the most significant accessibility interventions in the franchise's history, even though it was not framed in those terms at the time. By reducing the amount of grinding required to keep the entire party competitive with the game's progression, the XP share allowed players who lacked the patience or time for extended training sessions to complete the game without encountering insurmountable difficulty spikes. The change was controversial among experienced players who felt it reduced the satisfaction of the progression system, but it significantly expanded the range of players who could engage with the games comfortably. The introduction of the lower difficulty option in Black 2 and White 2, and the easy mode and challenge mode options that could be unlocked through communication with the original Black and White games, represented a more explicit engagement with accessibility as a design value. These options allowed players to choose their level of challenge, reducing the difficulty for those who found the standard game too demanding or increasing it for those who found it insufficiently challenging. The franchise has not consistently applied this approach across subsequent games, remaining somewhat inconsistent in its engagement with explicit difficulty options. The development of tutorials and introductory sequences across the franchise shows significant evolution in how the games conceptualize the player's prior knowledge and experience. The original games provided minimal guidance, assuming that players would learn through experimentation and would seek help from the manual or from more experienced players when they encountered difficulties. Later games introduced increasingly elaborate tutorial sequences that explained the game's systems more thoroughly, sometimes to the point of over-explanation that experienced players found patronizing. Finding the right balance between guidance for new players and respect for experienced ones is one of the franchise's persistent design challenges. The development of the game's approach is to narrative exposition, the way the story's events and their context are communicated to the player, has also evolved considerably across generations. The original games communicated almost all narrative content through brief dialogue exchanges with NPCs, with no voice acting, no cutscenes, and no extended story sequences. Later games introduced progressively more elaborate narrative presentation, with extended cutscene sequences, voiced character interactions in some cases, and story moments that were clearly designed to be emotionally impactful rather than simply informative. The development of narrative ambition in the franchise has been broadly welcomed, though there has been ongoing community discussion about the appropriate balance between story delivery and player agency. The development of the game's difficulty in relation to the quality of the artificial intelligence controlling opposing trainers is an area that has received less attention than it deserves. The original game's AI was relatively simple, making decisions based on limited information and sometimes choosing suboptimal moves in ways that made the game easier than it might otherwise have been. Later games have generally featured improved AI that makes better decisions, though the competitive community has documented cases in which the AI continues to make choices that human players would not. The development of genuinely sophisticated AI for Pokémon battles would require significant computational investment and would potentially make the games considerably more challenging for casual players, creating a tension that the franchise has navigated through relatively conservative AI development. The development of the franchise's visual identity across hardware generations represents one of the most dramatic evolutions in game aesthetics that any long-running franchise has undergone. The Pokémon of the original Game Boy games are defined by the constraints of that hardware: small, simple sprites with minimal shading, recognizable more through their overall silhouette than through fine detail. These sprites have acquired a kind of cultural authority through their age and their association with the franchise's origins, and many players retain deep affection for them that transcends any objective aesthetic evaluation. The move to the Game Boy Color allowed the introduction of color, which transformed the visual experience of the games while maintaining the same basic, sprite based aesthetic. The Johto games' color palettes were carefully chosen to differentiate between environments and to give each location a distinct visual identity. The warm ochres and greens of Ecruteak City feel different from the cool blues and grays of Mahogany Town, and these differences are not arbitrary. They communicate something about the character of each place that reinforces the experience of being there. The Game Boy Advance allowed for larger and more detailed sprites, and the Hoenn games used this expanded capability to create battle sprites that communicated Pokemon characters with greater expressiveness than had previously been possible. The way a Pokemon's sprite was posed and the details included in its design could now suggest personality and attitude in ways that smaller sprites could not achieve. The Ruby and Sapphire starters, in particular, were given battle sprites that communicated something of their characters. Triesco's cool, arms folded posture, Torchic's wide eyed eagerness, Mudkip's cheerful confidence. The Nintendo DS introduced a dual screen configuration that changed the spatial organization of the game experience in significant ways. The bottom screen displayed the player's bag, the party, the map, and other secondary information, freeing the top screen for the game world itself. The use of the touchscreen for certain interactions, including the Pokémon and Sinnoh's games, added a physical dimension to the interaction with the game's interface that felt genuinely new. The DS also allowed for more detailed environments, with greater visual differentiation between different areas of the map that made the experience of exploring the game world richer and more varied. The transition to the Nintendo 3DS and the introduction of three-dimensional character models for the Kalos games represented the franchise's most dramatic visual evolution. The shift from flat sprites to three-dimensional models required a complete rethinking of how Pokemon were presented in battle, how they moved, how they were scaled relative to each other, and how the camera's perspective affected the sense of encounter with each creature. The initial generation of three-dimensional models was celebrated for making the Pokemon feel more genuinely alive, more present in the space of the screen, even as some players mourned the loss of the distinctive sprite aesthetic that had defined the franchise's visual language for so long. The Nintendo Switch hardware has allowed the franchise's three-dimensional visual language to develop in further directions, with each generation's games using the hardware's capabilities to create more detailed environments, more complex lighting effects, and more expressive character animation. The development of open-world environments in particular has required significant advances in how the game world's visual content is generated and rendered. With the need to display large amounts of varied terrain and many simultaneously active characters, placing demands on the hardware and the development teams that did not exist in the more restricted visual contexts of earlier games. The development of the franchise's visual consistency across different media, the games, the anime, the trading card game, the merchandise, has been one of the more complex challenges of managing a global intellectual property. The Ken Sugimori illustration style that was established in the original games became the canonical visual reference for Pokémon design, used in the trading card game artwork and in promotional materials. The anime's visual style, which interprets the same designs through a more fluid and expressively animated aesthetic, created a slightly different visual language that informed how many players thought about the Pokemon's appearance, even while playing the games. The development of official Pokemon artwork for each generation has maintained a remarkable consistency of aesthetic approach across nearly 30 years. The characteristic Sugimori style, with its clean lines, its precise use of color to define form, and its tendency to show Pokemon in poses that communicate their character rather than simply their appearance, has been maintained as the franchise's visual standard, even as the number of artists contributing to the work has grown. The coherence of this visual standard across such a large body of work is itself an achievement that speaks to the strength of the foundational aesthetic framework that Sugimori established. There is a quality to the best Pokemon regions that might be called completeness, not in the sense of containing everything, but in the sense of feeling like they contain exactly what they need to. Each route has its own character. Each town has its own reason for existing. Each gym leader is a person with a life that extends beyond their role as an obstacle for the player. The Safari Zone, the Battle Frontier, the Berry Fields, the Underground, whatever the specific features of any given region, the best of them feel like elements of a coherent world rather than additions to a game. This quality of completeness is one of the hardest things to achieve in game design, and it is achieved through many small decisions that accumulate into an overall impression. The placement of a house in a particular location, the dialogue given to the person who lives in it, the view from their window, the Pokemon that appear in the grass visible from their door. None of these individual choices is especially significant, but their accumulation creates the sense that the world has been thought about in 3 dimensions, that it existed before the player arrived and will continue to exist after they leave. The development of that sense of 3 dimensional existence across the franchise's history has been one of its most reliable creative ambitions. The original games had it in modest form: the Pokemon Tower's gravity, the Team Rocket hideout's menace, the quiet sadness of the routes south of Lavender Town. Each subsequent generation has expanded the palette of emotions and impressions that the game world can communicate, adding more voices to the chorus of small details that collectively create the impression of a lived-in world. That impression, finally, is what the franchise's development history has been building toward across all its regions and all its years. Not spectacle, though spectacle has had its place. Not complexity, though complexity has deepened the experience for those who sought it. Not even the Pokemon themselves, beloved as they are, but the world around them, the sense that somewhere, in a digital landscape that has no physical reality, there is a place worth visiting, a journey worth taking, and a quiet that settles over everything when the day's traveling is finally done.